Greetings from Columbia Business School, Executive Education. I'm Scott Gardner, and I'm here today with Professor Stephan Meier and Jeff Schwartz for today's webinar, 5 Key Decisions to Manage the Future of Work in the Next Normal. Before I introduce them, I'd like to just go over a few quick logistics. As you'll see on the next slide, a recording of this webinar will be sent to you. If you'd like to tweet about this webinar, please do so at #CBSExecEd. And finally, please submit those questions to the Q&A box. We'll get to as many of those as possible in the last 10 minutes. It's my pleasure to introduce Stephan Meier. He is the James P. Gorman Professor of Business at Columbia Business School and the Chair of the Management Division. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Zurich and was previously a senior economist at the Center for Behavioral Economics and Decision-Making at the Federal Reserve Bank. His research and teaching interests are on the human side of strategy, how human decision-making are the center of sustainable competitive advantage. His work has been published in leading academic journals and has been covered by news outlets around the world. Jeff Schwartz is an adjunct assistant visiting professor at Columbia Business School and a retired senior principal at Deloitte Consulting, where he was the co-founder and leader of the U.S. Future of Work practice. He has been a global editor of Deloitte's Global Human Capital Trends report since its launch in 2011. He is the author of the recently published work, Work Disrupted, from Wiley, on accelerating challenges to the future of work, and the VP of Insights and Impact at Gloat, G-L-O-A-T, the world's leading AI platform for internal marketplaces. Both Stephan and Jeff are the co-faculty directors of our upcoming new executive education program launching this fall, Strategy and Leadership in the Future of Work. Stephan, Jeff, it's great to be with you today. I will leave the stage and rejoin you in the last 10 minutes.
Thanks so much, Scott, for this fantastic, flattering introduction. So welcome to our webinar on the future of work. So Jeff and I are super excited to share our thoughts about 5 decisions that we think managers need to make in order to prepare for the future. You know, even before the winter of 2020, technology was the driving force shaping our business strategy and consumer expectations. And then came the crisis, obviously, of 2020 and 21, a pandemic and an economic and social crisis. So together, they really accelerated, more accurately, many industries shifted us forwards as if in a time machine. So the future really became the present. And we can't just delay those decisions about the future of work or the present of work any longer. We need to make the decision now and decide, you know, how do we work? How is the workforce composition changing? And how does the workforce going to look like? While everybody is talking right now about the return to work or remote or work from anywhere arrangements, we believe that in order to prepare for the future and to beat the competition, leaders need to have a much broader view on the future of work. And those 5 questions that we will quickly talk about, we think are key. So Jeff, you have been thinking about the future of work for almost all your career, wrote a book about it, and have consulted with like countless companies about how best to prepare. So what do you see in your, what have you seen in your career and over the past 18 months, watching those shifts play out? What should business leaders and executives really thinking about what is going to happen in the next normal?
Thanks, Stephan. It's really great to be with everybody this morning or this afternoon or early this morning, depending on where you are in the world. I'm really appreciative to do this webinar. And as Stephan said, I'm very excited to both be working with Stephan to do an inaugural program for the Executive Ed program, but also we're teaching a course that we hope will become a core course at Columbia Business School on strategy and leadership in the future of work as well. And as Stephan is saying, as we're kicking this off today, a lot of the discussion in the last few months, when we talk about the future of work and strategy, has really been focused around the work from home and the hybrid question. What we're trying to present today is the idea that there are questions across work, workforce, and workplace. And what we're going to talk about over the next few minutes, and it's a lot to get into a 30-minute webinar, as Stephan and I have rehearsed a couple of times, is what we're calling 4+1 decisions. 4 decisions that senior executives need to make around work, workforce, and workplace. And then, of course, how these 4 decisions not only support strategy and leadership, but propel your strategy and leadership forward. We're going to talk about, obviously, the question on everyone's mind: how do you approach hybrid work? And really, what is the challenge as we're thinking about hybrid work? We're going to talk second about who and what is the workforce today, and how do we incorporate external talent, internal talent, and technology and machines into the workforce. We're going to talk about decisions relating to the changing expectations of careers. What is a 21st century career? And how do those differences actually shape what we do as business leaders? And then a question number 4, which in many ways was the question before the COVID era, is how do we design human and machine teams? How do we combine people and technology, both robots and AI, not only for automation, but also for augmentation and collaboration? And then how do these 4 questions, hybrid work, ecosystems and marketplaces, changing careers, human machine collaboration, how do we think about them in a way that they're integrated and they support our strategy? And then how do we prepare our leadership? The first question we're obviously going to talk about is this question relating to hybrid work. What we're going to try to do in each of these sections is ask the question, but also suggest how you can reframe the question to take more direct and more proactive executive action as decision makers. So let's start with this question at the top of the list, Stephan. Return to the office or not? Is that the right question?
Well, I mean, this is indeed kind of on top of everybody's mind, executives, and on top of headlines and news outlets. And let's start with what we do not know. We really do not know how executives will decide. You know, the spectrum of what firms are planning to do is vastly different and constantly changing. So there's this spectrum that is like on the bottom of the slides. You know, on one end of the spectrum is James Gorman, for example, you know, the CEO of Morgan Stanley and also the sponsor of my professor chair. He echoes kind of the feeling of most finance CEOs. You know, everybody is coming back to the office. Remote work is just not working as well as in person. On the other extreme are tech firms that basically communicate that remote or even full remote is here to stay. And then there are cases in between, like Amazon and Apple, who think about hybrid and then constantly pushing back the come back to office date. Now, a lot of that discussion has to do with, you know, how important is really in-person interaction for a company's success. You know, the arguments are about like certain aspects such as innovation can be done much better in person and whatnot. But we really think that the question is not whether we should do hybrid or remote work, but how to do it. You know, one reason why we shouldn't waste time on whether is that workers actually want to be flexible and then can be very productive in a work from home setting. You know, recent research, as you see on that slide, you know, showed that about 50% of respondents want to work at least 3 days per week from home or more. Only about 20% want to go fully remote if their work allows work from home. This is just the reality firms need to take into account. So much more important is how to manage and to change the culture. So let's really reframe the question. The question is not whether, but how do we design management practices and corporate culture to empower a workforce across on-site, off-site, and everything in between in ways that makes it productive. So let me give you 2 examples. So one is about promotions. For example, you know, there is a famous study on work from home for Chinese call center workers that showed that while those workers who work from home are much more productive, they're also less likely to be promoted, which is bizarre. You know, they're better and they're not getting promoted. Now, promotion and mentoring is really set up for in-person interaction. And out of sight in the office will unfortunately often lead to out of mind. We need to really carefully redesign how we think about the promotion process and make sure that remote workers, especially productive ones, have the same chances to get promoted, so not to create kind of a 2-class workforce. The second example is, you know, how we think about trust your workforce. You know, out of sight often leads to less control, almost inevitably. This makes executives extremely nervous. But the culture of trust is important in every organization, even if everyone who comes to the office. The pandemic just showed us that trusting your employees is becoming even more important in a remote setting. So executive really need to embrace it, foster it, and be comfortable with it. Maybe just start with giving some control to individuals and teams how to organize themselves in the remote hybrid future. So those are just two examples of how to actually change the way we think about the leadership and management style. But let's not just waste more time on whether, but spend time on how to change management and leadership for the next workspace strategy. But workspace strategy is just one way of the future at work. You know, Jeff, you always say what is also changing is the workforce changes with the workplace. You know, new type of workers, alternative work arrangements are becoming more and more important, supported by technology, and not just Uber drivers, obviously. What are the trends, and how do executives need to think about those and reframe the question, Jeff?
So the question of who and what is the workforce is one of the most interesting, and I'll put it this way, Stephan, strategic questions that companies are up against. It's particularly interesting. I mean, as we're doing this webinar September 1st, can't believe it's September, by the way, we're reading about supply chain bottlenecks and shortages everywhere. That not only is relevant for physical inventory and physical goods, it's also true for talent. We are facing a situation today where many companies, there's a statistic in the US, the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out, that reminds us that their companies are telling us that they have 10 million job openings, right, which is the highest number that the Bureau of Labor Statistics has ever reported since they started keeping that data. And what we're hearing from companies is they're feeling that they don't have the talent and the people with the right skills that they're looking for. Who and what is the workforce is one of the major questions in front of us. There's some very interesting research, especially over the last few years, that is helping us reframe this question. We're building on the work of Rahul Kapoor, who's been looking quite a bit and going into detail on how ecosystems themselves are the source of value. There's research that I was fortunate to be involved with MIT, Sloan Management Review, and Deloitte, looking at workforce ecosystems, framing the workforce by looking at the internal workforce, the external workforce, and how they're orchestrated in an ecosystem strategy. And then there's some great research from Josh Burson, who's one of the main global industry analysts in HR, who wrote a piece recently on what he called the explosion of internal marketplaces, looking not at workers and employees being assigned to one job, but actually how do we create a much higher degree of mobility, and how do we create internal gig markets at the same time. Again, some very interesting data here, just two or three data points to sort of anchor this discussion. When we ask most business leaders who are their workers and who are their employees, increasingly they say, you know, Jeff, Stephan, that's an interesting question, because they then ask, are you talking about our employees? Are you talking about our managed services contracts? Are you talking about our outsourced contracts? Should we include our gig workers, crowdsourced workers, volunteer workers, all the different people that are in some way playing a role producing the goods and services and experiences in our company? Two other data points just to frame this question about workforce. And they're both about the idea that we live in an era today, whether you call it the Great Resignation or the Great Reassessment, that workers and employees are looking for new opportunities, particularly opportunities for growth. And one of the challenges that companies are recognizing or I think facing flat out is that people are leaving because they can't find opportunity inside their organization. Research that I've done and others have done and point out that in most organizations, it's almost always easier to find a great job and opportunity outside the organization than inside the organization. And Microsoft published some research early on that said 40%, and we see numbers even higher, you know, 2 out of 5 workers, I think the number is more like 4 out of 5 workers are asking the question, do I want to work for this company and do I have the right opportunity? And so what we're suggesting in terms of this question is the question of who is your workforce really is becoming a broader question of who and what is your workforce. And how do you move from an employee lifecycle view to a view that is much more agile and much more far-reaching, not just focusing on employee and jobs, but also looking at markets and platforms and really asking the question, not only how do we acquire talent, but how do we access talent for full-time jobs, projects, and gigs? It really is an evolution of the workforce question. Now, the next piece we're going to look at, I'm going to ask you about, Stephan, is you've done a great deal of your research that's focusing on sort of behavioral aspects and the role of meaning in work. How is meaning and the view of meaning in the workforce changing, and how is that shifting the discussion that we're seeing around the workforce and what the priorities are going forward?
Right. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think careers are completely changing, and I see like two related trends that might actually help each other. You know, one is the one about meaning. You know, workers are looking more and more for meaning and purpose in their job. You know, the great resignation that you also mentioned, where workers are rethinking what they want to do with their life, is just one last sign of a trend that started way before the pandemic. You know, survey after survey, including one that I did among our MBA students, you know, showed that workers care about meaning much more so than in the past. The second trend is kind of that career path inevitably are changing very rapidly. You know, in the past, we lived kind of in three stages: education, work, retirement. But the new normal will be more an ebb and flow of portfolio of learning, work, and personal pursuit, as you see in the bottom of that slide. So if you go to the next one, so why is that? You know, it's basically two trends that I see. So one is like we just live much longer. You know, scientists claim that humans will live 100 or even 150 years. So there is a famous Canadian scientist who claimed that the first person who will live 150 years has already been born. Now, what does that mean? Kind of outside of consequences for pension system and so on. You know, what it means is we will work much longer, maybe 60 years or so. 60 years is a very, very long time in which the economy is transforming dramatically. You know, new jobs will be created. Many companies will eventually die and sectors will change. Second, you know, that's like we live longer. We also need to learn new skills more often than in the past, as the half-life of the technological skills is dropping to 5 years or even less. So many workers need to reskill and upskill much more often. So those interrelated trends, people want more meaning, we live longer, and there is the constant need for different skills, has obviously consequences for individual careers and career choices, but also how firms think about their workforce, and especially how HR policies are adapted from where they were designed for education, work, retirement. So how to reframe those questions? You know, what do we really have to think about executive? How do we create support and curate 21st century careers models to grow, stretch, and challenge workers and managers for careers with a future, not just a paycheck? And some companies who are forward-looking are actually tackling exactly that problem. So think Unilever, one of the largest packaged goods companies, an industry that's equally affected by digitalization in their core business, obviously. So Unilever introduced kind of a future of work framework, which has the individual employee at the center and is changing quite dramatically how they think about careers and the necessary skills. So one pillar is the lifelong learning and critical skills. They recognize that jobs are changing rapidly and that purpose and meaning and growth is very important for employees. So they give the employees the opportunity to think about their purpose and goals, but also then provide them with learning opportunities inside and outside the company to reskill and upskill and to reach their goal. So while it has some implementation challenges, obviously, it really shows kind of the way forward for companies to change their mindset and think about the career and so on. And it really needs like a mindset shift on the executive teams. But it might actually lead those two trends. In the end, it might tackle those two trends I mentioned at the beginning. It provides employees with necessary constant reskilling, and at the same time allows them to reach their goals of having more meaningful and more flexible careers with different jobs. But Jeff, I mean, part of the problem is also, as you mentioned at the very beginning, some of those workers are actually not humans anymore, but machines or even robots. So this sounds really scary to me. How do we deal with this human-machine interaction and make decisions going forward, Jeff?
No, thanks, Stephan. And the whole the notion of a 100-year life and a 60-year career, if that's not daunting enough, I think the other challenge that we've seen, and as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I think one of the major concerns that we've been talking with business leaders about the future of work, especially before the COVID era, was this whole question of the impact of automation and AI on the work and on the workforce. And I've had many discussions with companies around the world, and for many companies, again, this was before COVID, and COVID has really forced us and positioned us to think much more about the remote work and the hybrid work question. But the question at the top of everyone's mind is, what's going to happen to the workforce? How many jobs are going to be replaced by technology, by robots, robotic process automation, or AI? And do we think about this in terms of a robot apocalypse, or do we think about it as a sort of new era of the unleashed workforce? By the way, when I've asked people in conferences or webinars what their predominant view is, it's very interesting. The more senior you are in an organization, the more likely you're to see technology and humans as the unleashed workforce. The closer you are to the shop floor in an organization, you tend to think of it more as the robot apocalypse. So there's some very interesting perspectives there. Very briefly, as we've been thinking about this over the last couple of years, building on a lot of fascinating work, the work from Tom Malone at MIT, who wrote Superminds, the work of Eric Topol, who wrote a fantastic book called Deep Medicine on the role of AI in healthcare. What they help us focus on is the reframing from thinking about the role of technology in terms of an automation and a substitution strategy to the role of technology in creating what I'll call super jobs and super teams. How do we augment the work people are doing? And then how do we create super teams where people can collaborate in different ways? Darren Acemoglu, who's an economist at MIT, wrote an article a couple of years ago, and literally the title of the article is "The Wrong Kind of AI." And he challenges us to think about AI specifically, not only in terms of automation, but to ask the question, how do we use AI and new technology to do new things economically and to do new things that have an impact on society? And when we talk about super jobs, we're simply using the idea that when we add technology, tools, assistance, technology as a colleague, how can we structure jobs so that the people doing the job can do more work, more interesting work, and more value-added work? And similarly, how can we do something at the team level? Let me try to give two very specific examples, because I think this is a very important and powerful concept. When we introduced, and I didn't introduce it, but when we introduced the spreadsheet in the 1970s, Lotus 1-2-3, and then Excel, it had an amazing impact on both the finance function and financial services. Pretty much everybody in finance went from doing a job to a super job. Before we had spreadsheets, and it's sort of hard for some people to remember that we didn't always have spreadsheets, we had to do effectively calculations with calculators to do things like a net present value cash flow calculation, which meant that financial analysis was a fairly laborious and detailed set of activities. Once we invented the spreadsheet, we automated a piece of the work. We shifted the workforce from doing an administrative or a calculation piece of work to actually doing analysis, to understanding corporate requirements better, to understanding investor requirements better, and then thinking about what the different options were. The other point, just to raise very briefly, Stephan, is when we introduced the spreadsheet, it did not mean that fewer people worked in finance or financial services. In fact, quite the opposite. As we introduced the technology, the number of people working in the sector went up, the work of everybody changed, right? The other example I'll give very briefly is the introduction of the ATM machine. James Besson at Boston University Law School has written about this extensively. When we introduced the ATM machine, you might have thought that we would have fewer retail branches and fewer people working in retail branch banks. The opposite happened. We introduced them in late 1970s. The number of bank branches burgeoned, in part because we needed fewer people in each branch. The number of people working as retail bankers effectively doubled over the next 20, 25 years. And more interestingly, the job of every person in a retail branch changed, and the work that they were doing that could be done by a machine was done so that they could focus on work, advisory work, new products, risk, issues, for example, could be dealt with by them. There's a big question about how we are integrating technology into the workforce. I want to end, and we'll go to the last piece so we can stay online. The challenge for us, I believe, in the decision around human-machine collaboration is, as I mentioned a moment ago, to really think about automation, augmentation, and collaboration, and to push ourselves to think about, of course, we can use technology to automate work. But as Eric Topol says in his book, Deep Medicine, the really interesting question for us is to figure out what the 21st century Renaissance version of the work that we're doing is. If we could give our employees the gift of time, how can we use that time to create more value for our customers and more value for our organization, which I think leads into the last question, Stephan, which is how do we go to this 4+1 and put these 4 questions in service of strategy and leadership?
All right, thank you. Yeah, so maybe go to the next slide in the interest of time. You know, those decisions are all very difficult because they involve trade-offs, but we have to be extremely clear about what actually the goal is. You know, as in business strategy in general, when we think about expanding geographically or what business to acquire, we need to think about what's the end goal? What is actually our competitive advantage? The same is going to be true in the future of work. You know, those future of work strategies are then different between firms, and as they should be, because every firm's strategy, its way to differentiate is exactly that, different. So you have to think about to what end, as you see on that slide. You know, a lot of the discussion about the future of work are about how machines, automation is actually going to lower costs. So that's like the first column. But as you see now in those couple of minutes we talked about, you know, we're rarely talking about cost. Cost, of course, is important, but it's much more interesting to think about, is it actually creating value? Is it creating meaning to do so? So think about, for example, if you're a pizza chain. You know, if you're a pizza chain, you can think about how does technology help with my workforce? And I think almost all of the pizza chain then focus on cost and to kind of use their using gig workers for delivery that can lower the cost. But you can also think about the technology as increasing value, and then that choice for the pizza chain might differ quite dramatically. The Domino's Pizza is one of the only pizza chain that doesn't do gig workers. They think about much more holistically about the future of work and decide that they're not outsourcing to gig work, but keep delivery in-house. That allows them to be faster, having more control over the delivery, and then using the technology to augment the workforce that they're in-house. Now, it's also fascinating. Domino's Pizza is also the only one who uses in their advertising delivery robots. And so it's pretty clear that the future of work strategy for Domino's Pizza is less about cost and more about value. So looking at that 3x3, you know, cost, value, meaning, customer, workforce, companies. Jeff, in your extensive experience working with clients and thinking about basically this 3x3, how does that help, in your experience, those clients to make those decisions?
No, absolutely, Stephan. I'm going to make a couple of brief comments, and then we'll bring back Scott so we can get some questions. I think one way to think about this, and hopefully people can see the 3x3, and I often joke that, you know, having been a management consulting partner for 25 years, you know, we like putting things in 2x2 and 3x3 matrices. I think one of the observations that we've had, and one of the things that's been useful in discussions with business leaders, is a lot of the discussion around future of work initiatives, particularly technology, but also the workforce and even the workplace, are really clustered around the sort of lower left-hand quadrant here. They are often focused on cost, which is really about productivity and efficiency from the corporate perspective. Productivity is vitally important, but productivity is really a straightforward question. How do we do more of the same thing with fewer people and with fewer errors? And we absolutely have to do that. I think the point of looking at this in this broader framework of cost and value and meaning, but also impact, and from the enterprise perspective, the workforce perspective, the customer perspective, and probably also the society perspective, is to remind ourselves that when we're framing our strategies, especially in the 2020s, that we want to make sure that our strategy is covering the entire opportunity space, right? That our strategies are seldom only about cost, but they are almost always about differentiation and value and societal and community impact and individual impact. So how do we actually do that? Last point. One of the things we're challenging ourselves to think about, we challenge people on this webinar to think about, is how do we think about these 4 questions that we talked about? Workplace, the 2 workforce questions, human machine collaboration, and work. How do we think about them in a way that they actually propel our strategy forward, that they actually help shape our strategy, not just how do they support our strategy and how do they support our leaders? And my final observation, and we'll bring in Scott for the Q&A. It's been said over the last few years that every company in some way is a tech company. And I think it's an interesting way of thinking about what do we do with the observations that we've been discussing today. Because when we think about these questions, and we've highlighted some of these points during this discussion this morning, whether it's how do we approach hybrid, how do we think about talent marketplaces and workforce ecosystems, how do we think about the nature of 21st century careers, how do people in technology work together, and how does that integrate into our strategy and our leadership? Tech companies are pushing the envelope on all of these questions, right? And I think something that we're going to talk about both in the courses that we're doing and some of our subsequent writing is what we can learn from leading companies that are implementing these new strategies. So with that, Stephan, you and I will take a breath. We'll bring back Scott and we'll go into some Q&A if we have some time.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Stephan. Great information. We've got some wonderful questions. I would like to ask you if you could stay on with us for a little bit more time. We'll get to some of those questions. So let's kick it off. The first one is interesting to me because it's from Letitia and it's a 2-part question. She says, what do you think is the current maturity level of companies when faced with each of these 5 decisions about the future of work? And what would be the priority decision to be addressed by a company? Is there an order or a priority, or what do you see?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. I mean, both parts. So thanks so much. Maybe I kick it off and pass it on to Jeff. I actually think that the pandemic, but Jeff might disagree. You know, the pandemic actually put all those questions at the forefront while they were at the back burner for a while. Those were like HR questions and not top executive questions in the past, and then now the pandemic showed they're actually going to be top executive questions. I personally think about the priorities that we have to think kind of start with the last question first. You know, what's the goal of the future of work? How do we think about cost, value, and meaning? And if we're clear about that end goal, I think the other 4 are going to be easier to tackle. So that would be my sequencing of it. But Jeff, you might disagree with what I just said.
Well, to respond to the question, the first part of the question, I think that companies are all over the board when it comes to the urgency and the relevance of these questions. And if I just put it in a tiny bit of historical perspective, again, 2 years ago, it was the robot apocalypse, and now it's what's your hybrid strategy, right? And as I mentioned a second ago, we have this supply chain crunch, which is helping us sort of change our thinking about like, well, gee, who's in the workforce and how do I access them? And, you know, one of my favorite statistics is that, you know, it's 2021 and we're recruiting people into our companies who are 21 years old. That means that we are recruiting employees today, some of whom will live to be 100. And that means they're going to live to the year 2100. So these are all relevant questions for us, right? And sort of my suggestion in terms of priority, and I agree with you on this, Stephan, is companies are clearly recasting and thinking about what their priorities, their strategic priorities are going to be in the 2020s. The COVID experiment, the COVID era has helped us realize that it's not just going faster, it's actually shifting into a new gear, looking at what's happening in this decade. Once you have a sense of what that strategy is, I think that your executive leadership needs to have a point of view and a roadmap on all 4 of these questions. But should the pull for that be what your ambition is and what your strategy is? And it's hard to imagine that we're all not updating our strategies, given what we've learned through this great shift and this great disruption over the last couple of years. So all over the board, lead with strategy, and then have a clear view about how you're going to move forward on all four in some way. I'm not sure if any of this can really sit on the back burner for very long.
Great, great. Thank you very much. All right, so let's move on to the second question. It came in from Elke, and this is in terms of incentive systems. So she asks, how do you see the classic incentive systems changing, if at all, in the view of all of this change with work?
That's an interesting question. Maybe Jeff can kick us off on this one.
So I'm going to assume by incentive system, and this is my understanding of the question, that we've been wired pretty tightly as we've thought about incentive systems in business for the last, I don't know, 50 years. We've been very focused on compensation and the way we structure compensation packages and practices. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is we're getting pushed in two different directions at the same time, probably multiple directions. One is that when people had fairly linear career paths and we had a clear set of incentives with each step of your development, it was a little bit easier to use that traditional model. I think the other thing, and Stephan touched on this earlier, is that it's important to many workers, not all workers, that they're motivated not just by money, but they're also motivated by the work that they're doing, the people they're working with, and the social impact of what's actually being done by their company. It's a much more complicated equation. I love this question because this is one of the practices. I think the performance management practices and the compensation practices and the promotion practices and what I'll call the titling practices, sort of what level you are in an organization, all need to be probably reconsidered and reframed as we're moving into the 2020s. It's going to be a very interesting time to manage people. And that's why the Great Resignation and the Great Reassessment is a really good indicator that we probably need to be thinking about how do we do this differently, which is, I think, the heart of the question. Stephan, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree that those non-monetary incentives and non-monetary aspects of the job are becoming more and more important. You know, just recently I had a Wall Street Journal journalist ask me about, you know, their employees who like want to, you know, want to spend like 2 months in Aspen skiing or want to not work like 12 months. So what should they do? And I think what we touched on is like, that's actually the reality of what's going to happen. And if you don't change the way that you attract, hire, educate them, and give them actually some of those flexibility, you can't actually keep them. And it's part of the incentive system that is going to change. You know, maybe we have to think much more broadly about incentive than just money, but also, yeah, you have now time to get new learning opportunities, new growth opportunities within the companies, which all touch on, you know, how you think about workforce differently, workplace, and careers within the organization.
And one of the words I heard both of you say is the idea of learning about trust. You know, that is a huge incentive too, and that's such a large term when you think about what the implication for trust is. I want to combine two questions here. They just came in. And it's talking about those people who are not yet able to be in a hybrid office. And on the other side, the idea of the offices are saying, we're not having a hybrid, you're coming back. So the first part of it is those who can't do hybrid, how are you able to keep, you know, recommendation on implicating the work and the culture to new staff who are coming in and getting on the same page as a team that they've never met? You know, they're coming into a company where there is no ability to meet in person and develop this as a leader. And then the other side is those companies that are saying you're coming back and possibly the younger generation is going to leave. You know, they don't see it that way. So sort of a flip side, like two of the same issue, but just the opposite. Yeah.
I mean, so I think on the second one, you know, if firms are just not offering it, they're gonna have, but that's my view, you know, they're just not seeing the reality that some are just gonna leave. And maybe those who are gonna leave are the most productive, most motivated workers and they're going to lose them. In terms of, what is happening with if you either go completely remote and you think about the culture, or you're not able to work. Of course, you have to think about like how to create that culture. Just because people come to the office doesn't mean that you have a great culture. We often think about, oh, now if we don't come to the office, then we're losing all those amazing whatever. Just because people come physically to the office doesn't mean it's a great culture. So we have to work hard, whether they come into the office or whether they don't come into the office, and create a culture. Does that mean we're going to do offsites? We meet each other once a year and go river rafting and create a bonding experience that is much deeper than if I find something and then I ask my colleague where the coffee is on the floor. But Jeff.
No, I think this is a fantastic question. And sort of exactly as Stephan has highlighted, there's two aspects here. One is employees and workers have choice. And we will have been in this pandemic for something like 2 years in many parts of the world, at least 1.5 years. We have all tried out different ways of working, especially those of us that could work remotely or in a hybrid way, which was about 50% of the workforce could do some version of this. The perspectives of workers have changed, right? And this is a challenge, right? If we were talking about our customers, nobody would say, well, I mean, Henry Ford, I think, did say 100 years ago, you can get the car any color you want as long as it's black, right? I mean, that's not the way we sell products anymore, right? People expect a high degree of personalization and experience on the customer side. We are seeing something very similar, and we're seeing workers feel that their personal preferences are actually reasonable preferences to have, and they expect them to be incorporated into the way business leaders are managing. As we said at the beginning, hybrid is not about how many days a week you're in the office or not in the office. It's how you lead and manage and the role of culture. And I'll pick up one item that you mentioned, Stephan. I remember chatting with a client a year ago, and he said, no, we have to be in the office because that's where great culture is. I said, well, yeah, that's true. Before the pandemic, half of our work environments were toxic and half of them were great work environments. Just because we're in the office doesn't mean we have a great work environment. Thinking about how do we create that environment, recognizing that some people are going to be working, as we're saying, offsite. Some people are going to work remotely because they want to or they have to. They have families or other concerns. Some are going to be hybrid back and forth, and some are going to be in the office. How we manage all of those together, and that's a shift, is really one of the front and center questions we're looking at.
Great. All right. So I just want to finish this up with a question I like to ask at the end of every webinar that we do. And that is, the Columbia executive education culture is to be reflective after learning. And I also want to keep the energy going after this. So I always ask, what should the leaders who are on this call today, who are on this webinar today, what would you say today to keep the energy going, to reflect, is the first thing they should think about? I know you touched a little bit in the first question, but what would you say is the first thing? Leave this webinar, sit down and think about this first.
Mm-hmm. Well, so my thing is this, this is still up to like this 3x3, to the future of work to what end? Every leader can sit down today alone, ideally with a team, and think about what do we want a technology to achieve when we think about workplace, workforce, and work. And then you can think about what about cost, value, meaning, customer, workforce, and company. And I think that's a very good step. It's a hard step as well, but it's a very good step to start thinking about what do we really want to achieve with the future and work, not only support our strategy, but propel it. Jeff?
Yeah, no. I love this question. I love all the questions, actually, as you guys can tell from my responses. I think one way that I think about this, Scott and Stephan, is to ask the question, it's the first day of September. Many of us are beginning to plan for 2022, how we're going to finish up, get through the fourth quarter of 2021. I think this is a really valuable time to think about your post-pandemic strategy, which we can start to really think about, touch wood, right now. What do you want to achieve in 2022? And the question that I talk with people around the world with every day right now is, if it were December 2022, knowing what you know about hybrid work, about workforce markets and ecosystems, about the great resignation, which I think is a big deal, going to be a big deal in 2022, changing expectations of the workforce, human machine collaboration, the importance of having a strategy, right? What are the one or two decisions that you absolutely want to make sure that you've made progress on, right? What are the sort of, I don't want to go back and say, gee, I regret not having done X, Y, Z, right? And I think the big ones for me are the ones in the middle of the discussion that we were talking about today, these workforce questions. I view 2022, I sometimes joke, as the year of musical chairs. I think the number of people moving between and among companies may be at an all-time high. What are we doing to create growth and opportunity in our organization? How are we using ecosystem strategies and to actually get the talent supply that we need? Are we moving our expectations and our career and our growth models fast enough to deal with what are the changing expectations of the workforce, right? Where do you want to be at the end of 2022? Are those priorities in your plans that you're thinking about right now? There's a lot to think about and there's a lot to do.
Great. I love that thinking about if it was December 22. Well, it's a great, it's sort of like the opposite of this won't be important in a year. This, you're saying this will be important in a year. So start to think now. I love that. Thank you both so much, Stephan, Jeff. It's always great to work with you. And we thank all of you for joining us today. On behalf of Stephan, Jeff, Columbia Business School Executive Education, we thank you for joining us at the very center of business.